Welcome to Into Africa. My name is Judd Devermont. I am the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa and worked at the National Security Council. This is a podcast where we talk politics and challenge paradigms. On deck today, South Africa's response to the Covid-19 outbreak has been proactive and agile. What are the enduring obstacles and emerging challenges for this pivotal country? And Nigerian President Buhari's leadership and the country's federal structure presents challenges to the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. What are the opportunities to slow the negative health and economic impact of this disease? Plus, we discuss how COVID-19 is altering predictions about the future of work in sub-Saharan Africa. So whether you have a history with the continent or you're a newcomer, we want to get you into Africa. South Africa's response to the COVID-19 outbreak has been a regional standout.
As a result of these measures we imposed and the sacrifices that you made, we have managed to slow the rate of infection and prevent our health facilities from being overwhelmed.
What are the best practices from the South African experience? Joining me today to discuss South Africa and other issues is Laird Treiber, a senior State Department liaison for Prosper Africa, Chukwuka Onyekwena, the executive director at the Center for the Study of Economies of Africa, based in Abuja, Nigeria, and Vijaya Ramachandran, a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. In May, my colleague Topaz Mkulu and I published a critical questions article on South Africa's response. Our assessment was that Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership has been exemplary. He's been an effective communicator, listened to experts, and leveraged his country's experience fighting HIV, AIDS, and other infectious diseases. Laird, you were the economic counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria, so I'd love to hear your take. What's working and perhaps what are the challenges ahead?
Judd, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I look forward to the conversation. I agree with you. I think a lot of what South Africa has done, particularly under the leadership of President Ramaphosa, has been exemplary. And I think I would maybe point to a couple of things just in terms of the measures that have worked, and then I'll talk about maybe a couple of challenges that he also faces. Clearly, I think taking a bunch of very clear decisions early on and communicating them clearly to the public were very, very helpful. I think it's also been very helpful in terms of the testing regime that the government has set up. I know they're looking for more test kits now. They're trying to expand the scope and coverage, but they've done a number of innovative things, including some mobile test kits. They've clearly reached out to townships and some of the disadvantaged communities, et cetera. So I think all of that has given them a lot of the data they needed to actually figure out where they needed to intervene, to flatten the curve, what they needed to do, et cetera. The other thing was, I think that step that they took that was very helpful was from the beginning, they were quite clear that there would be some real impacts on the economy. And they also partnered with the business community in South Africa, including foreigners like American companies. It's notable the B4SA, the Business for South Africa coordination with the South African government has been exemplary in terms of identifying key areas of the economy that would be challenging and some clear steps that needed to be taken in terms of getting the economy up and going again. That's maybe perhaps where we should go next is talking about some of those challenges.
Well, why don't you walk us through some of those? And maybe I'll just add before we get to them, what I think has been really remarkable about Cyril is his humility. So just the day before we recorded this episode on May 14th, he gave a big speech and actually came right out with some of the challenges that they've had. And this will preview probably what you're going to say, Laird. But he said, look, some of the actions we have taken have been unclear, some have been contradictory, and some have been poorly explained. And he also said the enforcement has been inconsistent and too harsh. And I just marvel at a leader who is confident enough to take a self-assessment in the middle of a crisis and communicate what wasn't working and what's going well.
Yeah, Judd, I would completely agree with that. I think in terms of the challenges, unfortunately for South Africa, this, shall we say, the actual onset in March came after what had already been a tough year. There was a ratings downgrade. The ratings downgrade in January and February came frankly, after 5 years of slow or no economic growth. There's a number of challenges that South Africa has been coping with, particularly related to the previous government, including some corruption, but also the need to undertake a number of economic reforms, particularly for the state-owned enterprises, which form such a crucial part of the overall economy. Things like the state electricity provider, Eskom, South African Airways, etc. So unfortunately, South Africa entered the onset of COVID in a very difficult fiscal challenge in terms of the problems of not having addressed some of these structural reforms had come home to roost. And now with COVID, with the economic shutdown, that has added. So instead of 2 or 3% economic growth this year, which some folks had hoped might happen, they're looking at a 6 to 8% decline in GDP. And all this really exacerbates not just the pre-existing problems, but will make it much harder to address for me, the single biggest challenge, which is finding jobs for South Africans. South Africa was already at something like 29% unemployment in the formal sector, and the shutdown, as well as the impact, particularly on smaller and medium-sized enterprises, that total will increase. It's going to be a very challenging year in terms of getting some of those sectors started again. And the last thing I'll say is a lot of the ways that South Africa would tend to have recovered, or areas they would look to have recovered, will be difficult this year. They have a very significant exporting base in terms of manufacturing and services, things like that. But their top 3 export markets are Europe, United States, and China. All 3 of those are facing their own economic downturns. Other sectors that might normally have been looked to for early growth, things like tourism, things like financial services, etc., are also facing real significant changes that will be happening, real challenges for the short term. And so this will be a very tough year for South Africa in terms of navigating what will be some medium-term challenges. We can perhaps get into what the future might look like a little bit, but South Africa will need to undertake some of these tough reforms. And of course, it's always easier to do so when times are good, but unfortunately, all too many countries wait until a crisis where everything just becomes harder.
Yeah, in South Africa, I think many are echoing one of the complaints or one of the challenges that we have here in the United States, which is the cure worse than the disease? And so there has been a lot of hand-wringing and people's lives that have been deeply, deeply hurt by, the stringent lockdown. And this is tough, right? There are tough trade-offs between protecting the economy and then curbing COVID-19 spread. We're actually going to be having a debate on this topic at CSIS. But Chuka, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the trade-offs and how do you deal with this challenge of addressing the economy or protecting the economy, but protecting people's health. And in South Africa, of course, there's the deep inequality, which is a legacy of apartheid. That makes things even more difficult. So Ramaphosa's got so many challenges ahead of him to address, both in terms of ensuring access for all South African citizens, as Laird said, making sure the economy is open and can manage and weather this. What is your sense on the best way to sort of thread this needle? How does South Africa avoid a worst-case scenario?
Starting with the trade-offs, the trade-off between curbing the spread of the virus and protecting the economy is a global issue. But in Africa, it has very serious implications, given the high incidence of poverty in many countries. The key issue here is the predominance of the informal sector, where livelihood often depend on a steady flow of small daily savings, and also negative income shocks resulting from the slowdown or even the collapse of the economy and its effects on social cohesion and governance. Narrowing down to South Africa is characteristically an unequal society. The country has deep economic social inequalities that has persisted since the apartheid era. For example, about 7 million people live in the richest 20% of households, while about 4 to 5 million people live in the poorest 20% of households. In South Africa, about 3 million people work in the informal sector and live in informal settlements. These have low earnings, majority earn below the income tax threshold, and these informal settlements, they have high densities, high population densities, short supply of water, toilet facilities, and waste collections. So these in itself lends itself to high risk of disease transmission. And with the COVID-19 and the measures such as the lockdown, economic activities have halted, threatening the ability of informal workers to earn income at all. And the peculiar case of South Africa is that these challenges have racial and social dimensions, which can also worsen already existing racial tensions and incidents of xenophobia. In terms of what the government can do, I think there is an urgent need for the government to provide incentives for formal businesses to formalize. And this will enhance both revenue generation through taxes, as well as effective targeting of social protection interventions during this outbreak. But on the positive side, we've seen South Africa under the leadership of Cyril Ramaphosa doing a good job compared to most African countries in responding to this COVID-19 outbreak. In South Africa, there was timely response in implementing the lockdown measures, effective and widespread testing, and the approach has been collaborative, involving CSOs, religious organizations, and other informed citizens in enhancing this compliance. The president, as the AU chair, can use such platforms at the AU to engender an Africa-wide strategy for COVID response in the short, medium, and long term, drawing lessons from the South African experience. South Africa can champion peer learning initiatives and technical assistance to other countries in order to improve their capacity to respond to this pandemic.
Chuka, you read my mind. That is exactly where I wanted to end our conversation. I mean, first, I agree with your policy prescriptions. I think South Africa is doing a good job on some of those pro-poor policies that you mentioned, and particularly, I think, making it easier for businesses to lend money. But this question about can Ramaphosa lead, I think he's been one of the strongest AU chairs that we've seen in the history of that organization. And what I'd like to see him do is not only sort of galvanize and assemble, the crack team of finance ministers and former business leaders that he has to talk to the G20. But I think one of the tests ahead of Ramaphosa as the AU chair is what does he do with the Burundis and the Tanzanias and some of the countries that are really been problematic in their response. So those are, I think, really good points, Chuka, and I think some things for us to watch. Now, I'd like to move to Nigeria.
We have always been complaining that Nigeria has weak health system. And this weak system is about the poor or the perennial low budget of fund to the health system.
Maybe Chuka will agree, maybe he won't, but I haven't been as bullish on the Nigerian response to COVID-19. First, President Buhari is not a great communicator. As one of his defenders said, it's not his style. But there's been a number of really worrying numbers of unexplained deaths coming out of first Kano State, but now there's been reports in Bauchi State, in Yobe State, in other places in the north. I think it tells you a lot about the challenges of a federal system, just like here in the United States, where we see a diversity of responses across our country. That's been the case in Nigeria. Strong response, perhaps in Lagos, not strong in other places. And it does make a national response difficult, even when you have very competent health experts running the Nigerian CDC, etc. So, Chuka, please disagree with me. Let me know. What do you think? What would be your sort of grade scorecard for the federal government, and then maybe some of the states? Please don't go through all 36. And then what are the economic implications in your mind?
Actually, I agree with you in terms of differences in communication style between the South African president and the Nigerian president. Communication is not really the strength of the president of Nigeria, President Buhari. However, beyond his personal communication deficiencies, he has really empowered key institutions by setting up the Presidential Task Force on COVID-19, which includes key institutions like the Health Ministry, the Center for Disease Control, Aviation Ministry, and other relevant agencies. Similar to South Africa, Nigeria has also experienced I've gathered some experience in tackling infectious diseases, given previous outbreaks such as Ebola, polio, and Lassa fever. Thus, they already have institutions in place to tackle this sort of outbreak, even though the funding has not been adequate. However, with limited resources available, the NCDC has been quite active in working with the Ministry of Health in implementing a COVID response at both the federal and state levels. On the positive side, they've increased testing and contact tracing capabilities, created and expanded isolation centers, and then increased the frequency and scale of communication. There's daily communication on cases, recoveries, and deaths across Nigeria. However, with test levels of about 30,000 people, cumulatively, it is still very low compared to, given the population of 200 million people in Nigeria. At the state level, success is dependent on how effective the state administration coordinates with the health agencies like the CDC, and also the availability of resources. So you see states like Lagos that have, that is highly resourceful in terms of, they have a high internally generated revenue. So they've shown some good mileage and success in mobilizing resources, establishing isolation centers, and we've seen a high number of recoveries from those states. The governor of Rivers State has been very aggressive in imposing lockdowns. He personally goes around the streets hunting people that violate the lockdown measures. Kano State has been the problem. It's a commercial city. It's densely populated, about 13 million people in Kano State, and they have a cultural and religious practice that encourages community gatherings. So they at first they find it really difficult to comply with the social distancing measures, but the government had to come in and really impose lockdown measures in Kano State. And then a lot of community engagement, risk communications have been implemented in the state to really educate the masses, because also the northern states in Nigeria also battle with a lot of illiteracy, and they need to really educate them about how dangerous this outbreak is, and for them to comply with the social distancing measures. So we expect that to really drive down these rising cases in Kano and some of the northern states. But on the whole, success at the state level really depends on the availability of resources in terms of the state's income and revenue, and also the willingness of the state governor, the administration in place. Then moving to the economic challenges, the economic implications of this outbreak of Nigeria, it has been, quite severe. Nigeria has a twin challenge of tackling the COVID-19 pandemic and the recent crash in oil prices. These has caused huge fiscal challenges, a decline in revenue, as well as cuts to planned expenditure, which have both short and long-term impacts on the real sector. With a cut in capital expenditure, it will further weaken the capacity to tackle this very outbreak and other outbreaks in the future. Nigeria has the highest poverty incidence, and with job losses caused by these disruptions, and also the negative effects on the informal economy, the poverty situation is likely to worsen. So in essence, Nigeria is really facing a perfect storm.
Let's bring Vij in, because one of the things that is getting a lot of attention is sort of the way in which burgeoning technology sector and mobile phones are perhaps providing some, these are in some respects Band-Aids, but some ways in which people can address sort of the inability to get access school or to get medical. And Vij, you wrote this great report about Nigeria's tech sector, and I thought maybe you could help give us some realistic sense on what can technology in the Nigerian case help us when it comes to COVID-19?
Thanks, Judd. Thanks for having me on your show. I do think the tech sector in Nigeria can help a lot. and in a few different ways. First of all, there's a number of health tech companies in the tech sector that are reducing inefficiencies, that are saving money, that are connecting people to doctors. There's one example, LifeBank. It's a company that matches the need for blood with existing supplies of blood. It's greatly improved the efficiency in terms of patients who desperately need a blood transfusion, getting a blood transfusion on time by delivering blood from where it's deposited to where it's required. So that's an example of a health company. But then there's also, a number of companies in the tech sector that I think can help to improve consumer safety. And this has become a big issue all over the world. So it's everything from contactless payment systems to, delivery systems that are safer than going into a store or going into a supermarket. So I think in a number of ways, the tech sector, which is thriving in Nigeria, it has a booming tech sector. I think they will come up with many ways to keep people more safe, to deliver health services more efficiently, to be able to order medical supplies, for example. All of those things I think can be done better with the use of technology. And we're seeing a lot of these applications emerge in this very difficult environment.
Well, I'm really glad that you came out so positive. I have to sometimes curb my enthusiasm for the technical solutions. So I'm really glad that it was such a robust thumbs up for the tech sector. And I think we'll get into that in the main conversation that we're going to have. Laird, throughout our podcast, you're going to be the proponent and the advocate for the U.S. business sector. And I want to do a first run at it in this Nigeria section, which is, you did a stint at the Corporate Council in Africa, and I thought maybe you could help us think about the way the U.S. private sector could be helping Nigeria during the COVID-19 outbreak.
Thank you for that. I'll give you another thumbs up on some of the comments, particularly from Vij. In my current position as the state liaison for Prosper Africa, this is something that literally we spend every single day doing as working with coordinating 16 different USG agencies. And we're looking to promote U.S. and African trade and investment. And a lot of what we've been doing is, frankly, how can we better help plug in U.S. companies to deal with the current set of challenges, as well as now companies are getting a little bit better sense of what the ground truth is of post-COVID, to chart some of those senses of what does post-COVID or what does economic recovery begin to look like. And I completely agree with Chuka that the number of challenges in Nigeria are, Nigeria is a super complex place with all kinds of potential, but lots of challenges. And I think this would be a great opportunity not to waste a crisis. And so I think the Nigerians government and business have all known for a long time that Nigeria did need to diversify away from its such heavy reliance on the extractive industries, particularly from the oil sector. And I think this is the time to do that. So American companies are already super active, have long been active in Nigeria. And it's been great to see a number of them have really stepped up in the current crisis, but again, also kind of looking over the horizon, if you will. Just to give a shout out to two or three of them, certainly the Gates Foundation has been active across the continent, but they've announced an extra $150 million in terms of putting in place a lot of the critical sort of infrastructure, if you will, in terms of clinics and you're getting the training and the capacity and a lot of those kinds of things up and moving. They're absolutely focused on the innovation side of it. So a lot of those examples that Vij mentioned in terms of some of those using health tech or remote clinics or things like that, contactless or at least reduced contact kinds of delivery. This is absolutely a great way to bring in new players, to expand some players that have been perhaps a bit more marginal. And Visa, I think, would be another company to flag. They have announced $210 million to support medium and small enterprises. And again, a lot of that is precisely in some of those areas that Vij mentioned in terms of things like how do you get a secure payment system if you can't go down to your local bank, or if, frankly, if you no longer, you want your customer to be happy, but you don't really want to exchange currency with them, physically, etc. So Visa has done some really interesting, innovative things, and they've been super aggressive about rolling that out. A number of other U.S. companies in the fintech space across West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa have been doing similar kinds of things. And then some of the more traditional folks, so Citibank, for instance, has announced a relatively large percentage of its worldwide response has been in Nigeria. Other companies like Procter & Gamble, et cetera, have big presences there and have been very active in terms of trying to help both their teams, their people, as well as their customers and their local communities. Maybe just to set up kind of the next discussion anyway, I think Nigeria has set a pretty good stage in terms of not just taking some of the key actions that they needed to stabilize the economy, but they've also set up a government-private sector coordination group, CA COVID, which has created a pretty good platform for companies to work with governments in terms of being able to provide some of the fast-acting responses and assistance, kind of where things are needed, et cetera. I think that will be critical as Nigeria shifts or pivots to what does economic recovery start to look like. And maybe the one other piece just to flag, an absolutely critical piece of support has been the IMF's, frankly, historic $3.4 billion program, which I think will help the government actually start making some of those long-term fiscal reforms, the structural reforms that, frankly, in terms of really opening up the tech sector or some of these other sectors that have such great potential, a lot of those need either some regulatory structure or they need some capacity building, things like that. They face some issues as to what would be needed to really unleash them. And the IMF program is a pretty good start to provide the framework that companies or foreign investors would need to really build that out.
Not only, Laird, was that a great segue to our main topic, but it allows me to plug a piece that we just published. We did a piece that references CA COVID, looking at the role of philanthropy in Nigeria responding to both COVID, but the main focus of that piece is what more can philanthropists do to respond to the humanitarian crisis in northern Nigeria, northeast Nigeria. So we'll put a link to that piece in the show notes. So let's move to the topic today, which is the future of work.
The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic continues to wreak havoc on the global economy. Among those sectors affected, financial technology startups across Africa, which had been offering a helping hand to an underdeveloped industry. In fact, experts say that the continent had experienced a fintech revolution.
If you work in a think tank, everything has to be the future of blank. And probably the one that gets the most attention is the future of work. I'm not denigrating, I'm just pointing it out that there are certain ways that we talk about things at think tank land, and this is certainly one of them. And Vij, you did an event at CGD at your think tank, Center for Global Development, in December of last year. And so maybe just a high-level summary of what do people mean when they say the future of work when it comes to African economies, and that hopefully will set us up a baseline to really talk about the pre-COVID and a post-COVID world.
So I think, in the African context, we have a huge demographic dividend, right? We have tens of millions of people who will be entering the labor market over the next several decades. And I think the question for all of us, academics, policymakers, people in think tanks, is how do we create sort of the right conditions for all of these people to find jobs? And I think that's what's worrying us all. And in the sort of pre-COVID world, I think what we were most worried about was the rise of automation. Are the robots going to come and get us was the main question, I think. And I think in that context, we were sort of worried about the fact that, most countries have industrialized through low-cost manufacturing, low-cost, low-skill manufacturing. And I think we're worried that as those processes become automated, where are the jobs going to be for countries that are newly industrializing? for countries that are leaving agriculture and trying to become kind of modern industrialized economies. How are we going to provide jobs for people who are transitioning from rural to urban areas? I think those were the big questions that, we were thinking about and continue to think about. And we are worried, I think, that automation is removing jobs or taking away jobs. I think there's also sort of a related phenomenon, which is the blurring of manufacturing and services. So, something like the cutting and sewing of cloth in the garment sector is now becoming automated. So the person doing the cutting is no longer cutting fabric with a pair of scissors. They are using a computer program or writing a computer program that will cut the fabric for them. And so, the job is transitioning from being sort of a manufacturing-based job to being kind of a more services-based job where you need computer skills. And so I think these are the sorts of questions we're trying to grapple with. What are going to be the skills that are needed for people to be able to enter these sectors as the nature of these jobs are changing dramatically. And if you do have a situation where millions of people need to be entering the job market, how do we cope as technology is changing the way work is done?
Yeah, the World Bank produced a paper on the future of work, and it's interesting, Vij, that the way I read it, strongly on the side of that automation and digital technology wouldn't disrupt too many jobs in Africa, given sort of the low base and the work that is going on right now. And not surprising, it concludes with the challenge here is good policy. I think that's a fairly straightforward answer for almost any problem set. But, their focus is on competition, attracting capital, and then in investing in capacity. And I wanted to ask Chuka, but certainly Vij and Laird, if you want to jump in as well. I mean, do you agree with that? And then as we kind of get into the meat of this conversation does COVID-19 change that conversation?
Yeah, I think yes. The pre-COVID narrative has, in relation with job and the future of work in Africa, there was this sense of worry about the disruption of jobs as a result of digital technology and automation. It was worrisome because one of the biggest problems in Africa is job creation, which really threatens our capacity to reduce the poverty incidence. But here comes this COVID pandemic that has really shown the importance of the adoption of digital technology, both in public service delivery, communications, logistics, the health sector, like Vij has mentioned. The experience has been that the sectors that really thrived during the lockdown periods are mostly the ones that could really operate using digital technologies. So the pandemic has really presented an evidence of the positive side of adopting digital technologies, as opposed to the pre-COVID narrative that these, adoption of digital technologies would disrupt jobs in Africa. I also think that Africa has huge potentials to increase the adoption of digital technology, given the young population as a result of the demographic dividend. And also, Africa has increasingly been active on social media. So it stands to readily increase this adoption of digital technology and automation. It's quite impressive hearing from Vij and later the investments, particularly from the private sector, digital technology. But we are really exploring how do we increase this adoption. Our experience with sectors like education has shown that this COVID pandemic brought a massive disruption to the school cycle because of inabilities to adopt digital technology in learning. There was very limited capacity for remote learning options, particularly in public schools, which has really disrupted education. And so moving to a long-term goal of diversifying the economy, digital technology stands as an option of, how do we use digital technology and apply them in sectors, the real sectors that will lead Nigeria to diversify away from the oil dependence and also improve, other sectors that can absorb more jobs. So I think there is a lot of potentials in digital technologies in Africa, and this in Africa, particularly Nigeria, And this COVID pandemic has really shown those opportunities.
Bitch, can you kind of add to Chuka's comments, especially because you've done so much work on the tech sector and your paper, I don't know how many years ago it is now, but on manufacturing, the obstacles to manufacturing may be the most cited thing I use when talking to people and pretending that I know something about economics. But has COVID-19 changed the way that you're thinking about African economies and opportunities and challenges?
So I think the COVID-19 pandemic and, the related events are perhaps giving a boost to these types of digital technologies and the development of the tech sector in Africa. There's another example, in today's Financial Times of Thrive Masiwa funding a platform to pool medical supplies orders across Africa, working in collaboration with Africa CDC. So I think there are opportunities that the pandemic is presenting in terms of developing the tech sector. Now, the paper you mentioned, Judd, my paper on labor costs, what we find is that labor costs in many countries are probably too high to attract the very low cost, low skill manufacturing that has powered growth in Bangladesh or even in East Asia back in the 60s and 70s. But it may well be that the skill mix and the cost profile is better suited to a services sector, including the tech sector. And there may be a lot of scope for growth, more scope than manufacturing perhaps. And I think in terms of policy, you mentioned the World Bank report earlier. The key policy to me is investment in education and making sure that this very large population of young people have the right skills to enter the tech sector, because in many ways that is the place to be. It's borderless. You don't have to worry about where you are. You can do the work from wherever you are. You can work for an American company. You can work for companies in Europe. You can work for companies inside Africa. So I think there's a lot of potential for this sector, and the pandemic is probably going to give rise to more applications, more creative thinking to address the current crisis, and that perhaps will benefit the tech sector in the long term. So I'm optimistic about the tech sector.
Yeah, there's been some really interesting policies from the governments on both mobile money, which kind of builds on what Laird said, but also in education. And just on mobile money, we've seen, particularly in West Africa, most of the fees around setting up mobile money accounts, particularly with MTN, a South African company, being waived. And then the cost of transferring money have been lowered. On education in South Africa on the tertiary level, because all the universities are struggling with how do you teach your students in this pandemic, they've been giving data plans. They've been giving free gigabytes up to a certain amount to their students and providing laptops. So it may result in a higher adoption rate, which I think is phenomenal, because that had been one of the stumbling blocks, is just the high cost of data or access, and you need those things so that you can actually really open up and unlock the tech sector. So there's a real potential here for better policies because of COVID-19. I want to end our conversation talking about, not surprising, where the U.S. is, because the United States government has already spent, I think the number right now is almost $1 billion, $900 million for Africa in response to COVID-19, and the New Development Finance Corporation and Prosper Africa are encouraging more U.S. investments. And I think the DFC just came out, Laird, you can correct me, with a call for investments specifically related to COVID-19. So if you could build a little more on what the U.S. is doing and the opportunities for the U.S. in a post-COVID-19, I think that would be fantastic. And then, we'll just make it a straight up pitch. Like, what does the private sector need to know about what Prosper Africa and the U.S. government is doing to make investment easier, even in these difficult times?
Great set of questions. I guess maybe just to begin building on the previous discussion, while I'm just as bullish on the prospects for the tech sector in Africa in particular, I would suggest that we shouldn't give up on the real economy. If I had to suggest one of the biggest things that will change, I think it's the business models that previously there wasn't a whole lot of value assigned to redundancy or, shall we say, security of supply, that sort of stuff. I think that is one of the first things that will be re-examined. I think companies are already scrambling So, for instance, if the key supplier in the health sector, for instance, of an active ingredient is in one country and there's no planes flying, no ships sailing, what do you do? And so there's a whole bunch of re-examination that will take place. This is something where there's already a number of U.S. companies that are looking at, does it make sense to work with African partners? Does it make sense to make investments in making PPE, in making some of these more advanced equipment, et cetera? By far the biggest thing that American companies have long looked for is just a clearer sense of what is the trade and investment story in Africa. And I think for a lot of American companies, the challenge has been 54 countries with different, lack of harmonized trade rules, lack of harmonized investment rules, et cetera. And so one of the most important things pre-COVID was the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that literally was solving a lot of those key issues. Not just harmonizing rules and regulations, not just sorting out things like tariffs, but also setting up really innovative mechanisms. So the U.S. government has been strongly supportive of AFCFTA, and we're continuing to work with the African Union and with member countries as they walk through the start of phase 2. Phase 1 was supposed to start in this July. We'll see kind of when all that happens, but I would keep your eye on the physical side of it. So it's getting the policies right at the continental level, getting them right at the country level, and then some of the related infrastructure to make all of that stronger pitch, if you will. U.S. government is also, we do a number of things working with individual countries to execute that vision. And so the World Trade Organization, for instance, the last 7 or 8 years has had this trade facilitation agreement, which literally walks a country through how do I be more effective to get a good, let's say a vaccine or whatever it might be, through a port in as safe and quick a manner as possible. I think that will become even more important as we continue to move on. And then USTR, for instance, has announced it is negotiating its first of what it hopes to be several free trade agreements with Kenya. And again, all of these things just make it clearer for U.S. investors, what the rules of the road are in terms of trade as well as investment. Beyond that, I think particularly important as international supply chains shift, totally understand that U.S. companies often need some help in terms of better understanding as well as also addressing some of the specific commercial risk items. And that indeed is what Prosper Africa was set up to do. We have set up deal teams at every embassy across Africa. It's a much more effective platform for working with African as well as U.S. companies on specific opportunities, but also on kind of the broader reform set of things. You mentioned a number of our agencies have some very helpful programs. DFC has just announced this week $2 billion program focused just on health innovation, health investments in Africa. They've just put it on their website and they're looking for expressions of interest. They're looking to do deals, if you will. And so it's a really exciting opportunity. Again, the whole point is it is focused on health and COVID, but again, it builds into this broader narrative. This could be a real opportunity for Africa to further sharpen and or rewrite some of its trade and investment story as it makes a more compelling case in terms of what the future supply chains might look like.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Laird. And I do think that Prosper Africa is, a critical initiative that has come out of this administration. And in many ways, I think COVID-19 may give it an opportunity to shine because I think companies are going to be looking to the U.S. government to think about how to move forward in this new environment in the post-COVID world. So let me thank everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judd.
Thank you, Laird. And thank you, Vij and Thomas. It's been a great session.
Thanks for listening. We want to have more conversations about Africa. Tell your friends, subscribe to our podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you find good content. You can also check out our analysis and reports at csis.org/Africa. Thanks.